which is an area that I work on from a policy perspective and also from an obesity perspective. And I'm going to try to really put a spin on this and how the hunger epidemic really is influencing children. So, when you think about hunger, when you ask most people to think about hunger, the images that generally come to mind in America are pictures maybe of the Great Depression, or pictures globally of what hunger looks like in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. But the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of hunger in the United States, and it's very, very difficult, it's impossible really, to pick out who is hungry from who is not hungry in the United States. These pictures, which I'm not sure are all that clear from the back of the room, are all pictures of people in the United States in the last few years lining up at food pantries. They look like you and I, and what you might notice is that rather than the average person here looking malnourished, skinny, lack of access to food, actually there are many, many, many people who are obese. And the question is, how is this epidemic of hunger interacting with obesity in our society? And I think we really have to understand these root causes in order to figure out how we address them. So in order to start, we have to make a few key distinctions. And the first distinction is between two important concepts, that of hunger and that of food insecurity. So hunger is a physical sensation. It's the uncomfortable feeling that you will probably have at 11:49 when you know that in 10 minutes lunch is going to be served. It's what happens when you diet. Everybody feels hungry all the time. And we make this distinction between hunger and this term food insecurity, which honestly is not a term I love because I think it really blunts your emotional response to what it means to be hungry. But it's important because it encompasses a much broader range of behaviors than just the feeling of being hungry. So the official definition of food insecurity is the limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods, or the limited ability to acquire acceptable foods in what we call socially acceptable ways, which is a terrible term. I didn't come up with it. It basically means if you are enrolling in a federal nutrition program, lining up at a food pantry, sending your kids to grandma's house to eat, anything that's outside of normal shopping and eating practices is considered a not socially acceptable way of eating, according to this definition. Now, the interesting thing about food insecurity is that, in contrast to hunger, which is just this physical sensation, food insecurity encompasses this whole range of behaviors that people use in order to avoid the sensation of going hungry. So, if you know that you're not going to have dinner tonight, you might do a bunch of things this morning and at lunchtime in order to avoid being hungry at dinner time. We're hardwired to do this, and this is how you would survive out in the Great Plains. What might you do? You might shift your dietary intake towards very low-cost foods, which in this country tends to be fewer fruits and vegetables, more fats and carbs. You would probably eat very highly filling foods. You would decrease the variety of your foods to those foods that you were pretty sure would fill you up and keep you full for a long period of time. You might go to great lengths to avoid food waste. You might engage some abnormal eating behaviors like binging. Now, the interesting thing about these eating behaviors, and there are many more coping strategies that people use, but these are very common coping strategies, and the interesting thing about these is that these are all behaviors that we think predispose people to obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Now, shockingly enough, 1 in 7 households in the United States is food insecure. 1 out of every 7 households, that's more than 14% of the U.S. population. This is not just a consequence of the recession. The food insecurity rate in the U.S. before the recession hit stayed pretty constant between 10 and 11%. So this is not just a recession problem. This is the way it is in the U.S. We divide food insecurity into households with low food security. These are people who've mostly changed the quality of the food they eat, but not the quantity. So they're not missing meals. They're not eating very small meals because they can't afford to eat bigger meals, but they're changing the way that they eat. And then those with the very low food security who are also getting a reduced quantity of meals. This corresponds to 8.6 million kids living in low food security households and 765,000 kids living in the U.S. in very low food secure households. Common problem. In terms of risk factors at the household level, we know that 1 in 5 children in the United States is living in a food insecure household. This rate is particularly high if you live in a household headed by a single mother, where more than 1/3 of all kids are living in food insecure households. Being a child under the age of 6 is also a risk factor. Clearly, if you're poor or you're from a racial or ethnic minority group. And we also know that if mom or dad smokes, you're much more likely to be food insecure because it draws so much money away from the food budget. A very modifiable risk factor. Of all of these, a smoker in the household is the most modifiable risk factor for food insecurity. Nearly 50% of U.S. children and 90% of Black children will be on food stamps at some point during their childhood. So if you think that this experience is not a normal experience in the U.S., reflect on this. 90% of Black children. Now, this is not necessarily sustained usage of food stamps, which we now call SNAP. I assume that this audience knows SNAP well. This study was done looking backwards over decades, so mostly in the food stamp era. People are not staying on SNAP for decades at a time, but people are coming on and off the rolls over time. So, and 90% of Black children, 50% of all children in the U.S. will have this experience. Okay. In the U.S., this is different from global food insecurity. In the U.S., there is a predictable progression of strategies that households use in order to cope with the experience of being food insecure. If you're just worrying that your food is going to run out and you won't have money to buy more, or you're worrying that your food won't last, we actually in the U.S. call you food secure, which is sort of ironic, but this is a conservative, when we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking about a relatively high bar to become food insecure. The first thing that happens, traditionally, is that the adults in the household would be affected. And we know, because we see this over and over, that the adults, mostly the mothers in the household, tend to shield the children from the effects of food insecurity by altering their own dietary intake before they alter the dietary intake of their children. This is one of the ways we get to this low food security and very low food security categories, with this sort of understanding that if you're low food secure, this is traditionally only the adults in the household who are affected, but if you're very low food secure, the children in the house are affected as well. And what we're really starting to understand is that this has no basis in reality. There is no food insecure household in which the children are not affected. The children know what's going on. The children are often protecting the parents at the same time as the parents are protecting the children. And when we look at adverse health outcomes associated with food security, we see them in the children even in these low food security categories. So we know that children are highly affected by this experience within their household. Just one example from a pantry client in San Francisco, if it wasn't for the food pantry, a lot of the time I'd have to let the kids eat and I wouldn't. This is a very, very common coping strategy among mothers. What we know is the kids also generally know that the mom's not eating until they finish, and what do the kids do? They don't eat as much because they want mom to have more. So this sets up a very stressful dynamic within the household. We know in children, as I said, that the health consequences of food insecurity start with mild food insecurity, with mild levels of food insecurity. And the health consequences have been very well documented in children. Poor health status, more frequent infections, stomach aches, urinary, upper respiratory infections, headaches, fatigues, iron deficiency, anemia, a whole host of poor health consequences, including cognitive function and lower school achievement. These were the arguments around the establishment of the WIC program in the beginning, was that this evidence is so clear that if you don't allow children access to healthy dietary intake when they're young, they don't reach their economic potential. This was an economic argument that was originally being made. And many studies looking at rates of obesity among children. And I will say that the food insecure child may or may not be at higher risk of obesity during childhood. The evidence is very up and down. There are many studies that suggest these children are more likely to be obese. There are many studies that suggest they aren't. What we do know is that as that child ages in a food insecure household, they are more likely to be obese, particularly among the girls. And we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so if we just look at food insecurity across the U.S. among generally low-income women, and we look at their mean body mass index according to their food security status, we see this really funny relationship where these are food secure women, mean BMI 28.9 in the US, and these are severely food insecure women, same BMI, they look exactly the same. But over and over, in study after study, what we see is these women in the mild food insecure category are more obese. In this case, across the US, 11.4 pounds more obese on average. It's a funny relationship because if you expected food insecurity to really be causing obesity, you would probably expect that as you became more food insecure, you would become more obese. Or, as many people would predict, you would think, well, if you became more food insecure and you had less access to food, most people in the US would predict that you would become less obese. So this is a really, really funny relationship. And I want you to hold this in your head because I think that the reason behind this funny relationship is very clear, and we'll get to it in a minute. All right, so I like to think of three mechanisms by which food insecurity predisposes people to obesity and chronic disease, and I'm going to review these three. The first is nutrition, and this is very highly linked to food affordability. The second is eating behaviors, which I alluded to. This is very tightly tightly attached to the episodic nature of food availability in a food insecure household. And the last issue is stress. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about food affordability. I suspect that many of this in this audience are very savvy about food affordability, but I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page because I think this is really particularly important in the food insecure household. First, we have to go back to that funny relationship I just showed you where the mildly food insecure woman is more likely to be obese. This hypothesis was put forward in 2002 by a man named Peter Basiotis, who was trying to figure out why all of our studies kept showing that food insecure women, particularly mildly food insecure women, were more likely to be obese. And what he said was, this is sort of a complicated picture, but if you look at this top line here, this is the amount of money that you spend on food. And as your income goes up, you spend a lot of money on food up to some threshold value. And if you spend a lot of money on food, you are easily able to meet your food energy requirements right here. Now, if you are really, really, really low income, or you're very food secure, you spend much less money on food, and because you're not able to get an adequate quantity of food, you're not able to reach your food energy requirements and you lose weight. But in this middle category, you're able to engage these coping strategies that I talked about earlier, shifting your dietary intake, etc., to this middle range, and then not only are you able to meet your food energy requirement, but you may even actually supersede your food energy requirement. And the interesting thing about this hypothesis is that when you look at that upside down U-shaped curve, you think that the severely food insecure woman and the food secure women were the same. But even though they have the same body mass index, they're really different. Because this woman is not getting enough to eat and is eating a poor diet. This woman is getting enough to eat and is eating a poor diet, and as the hypothesis says, this woman is eating a good diet. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a complicated hypothesis. We know that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is true. If you had just $1 to feed yourself per day, and that's a very, very low amount, but if you had just $1 and you were a rational economic consumer and you went into the grocery store with $1 and you wanted to get the most calories that you could for that $1, what would you buy in the US? Oil, shortening, margarine, butter, sugar, bread, pasta, and rice. That's how you might be able to maintain your caloric needs. Clearly, we don't want people to do this. You'll also notice in our squares and triangles here that in the US, calorie for calorie, fruits and vegetables cost more than any of these other foods. I haven't updated this since July of 2013, but if you go into the grocery store, even in San Francisco, as an example, with $2, remember that an average SNAP, what we call CalFresh in California, the average SNAP benefit in California now, does anybody know how much it is? You probably know. $4.50 per person per day. So if you only are feeding yourself off your SNAP or your CalFresh or your food stamp budget, you have approximately $1.50 per meal. So it's not unrealistic to think that you would go into Safeway with $2 to feed yourself. You could buy yourself a cheap vegetable like carrots and get yourself 384 calories with your entire bag of carrots, or you could get yourself 1,500 calories worth of Keebler Fudge Stripe cookies. So the moral of this story is that it's actually a rational economic decision, if you want to get all your calories, to go with the Keebler Fudge Stripes. All right. $4.90 is no longer accurate. Food stamp benefits have gone down since the expiration of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. All right, this is the Consumer Price Index for food between 1980 and 2010. The CPI for food tells you the average price of an average market of goods for the average consumer in the United States. It's measured by the USDA. And in InHanes, and what you see is that the CPI for food in this black line has been increasing over the last 30 years. If you look at those foods that have been pulling the CPI for food up or becoming relatively more expensive over time, it's fresh fruits and vegetables, and those foods that are keeping the CPI for food relatively low in our red and green bars here are non-alcoholic beverages and carbonated drinks, becoming relatively less expensive over time. Now, this doesn't matter for most people if you're living in a household that is a low-income or a middle-income household. You probably, if you're not in a food insecure household, are spending between 5 and 10, maybe 12% of your entire budget on food. If you live in a low-income household, you're using upwards of a third of your entire household budget on food. A third of your entire budget. Think to yourself, if you were spending a third of your budget on food, would you be able to afford your rent? Most people cannot. I want to mention also that the per capita availability of fruits and vegetables has been declining in the US over the last 20 years, putting additional upward pressures on prices. And we know that in situations like this, there are winners and losers. Okay, a diet recommended by the USDA would require a low-income family to spend up to 70% of their food budget just on fruits and vegetables. So now think back to how many calories that's going to get you and whether your kids will be going to bed hungry. Increasing your potassium consumption, potassium being from fruits and vegetables generally, to meet the USDA requirements would require an average consumer to increase their food costs by $380 per year. This is months worth of food stamps benefits for a person, by the way. All right. It is also true that whether healthy foods cost okay, let me just say that. It's also true that it is controversial whether healthy foods cost more than unhealthy foods. And there are many people who will disagree with the previous 10 slides. What is not controversial is that there is a perception in food insecure households that fruits and vegetables cost more. And whether you believe this or not, really we definitely have to address the fact that there is a perception that fruits and vegetables cost more. And part of the reason for this is that when you really dig down into this perception of fruits and vegetables costing more, it isn't just about the actual cost that you're laying out at the cash register at the grocery store. It's also about the amount of time it takes for preparation. Everybody's time is worth a lot, but particularly if you're a single mother and you have 3 kids. It's the cost of having equipment for storage and preparation. It means your gas and your utilities can't have been cut off. You have to have a working refrigerator and a stove and an oven for preparation. You have to have time and money to travel to a full-service grocery store. There's lots of things that go into what people call the cost of fruits and vegetables being too high. What do we know about dietary intake in food insecure children? We know that, I'm just going to give you two more recent studies. There's much data, other data that's very similar to this. In one recent study, 65% of families receiving infant formula through WIC reported running out before the end of the month. We know that food insecure moms are particularly likely to stretch their infant formula, either by diluting it, by feeding smaller amounts, by stretching, etc. We also know that SNAP and WIC are strongly associated with food insecurity, which seems ironic to begin with. But what we know is that SNAP and WIC are actually quite good at reducing the depth and breadth of food insecurity, but that people who are food insecure opt into being on SNAP and WIC, and that's a good thing. They're actually highly effective programs for reducing food insecurity overall. Another pretty recent study from American Journal of Public Health looking at adolescents. Parents of adolescents are much more likely to report that fruits and vegetables are too expensive to feed their children. They actually do serve less fruit salad, less veggies, less fruit, less milk, and more sugar-sweetened beverages and fast food, which are considered to be more affordable. They also spend a lot more time preparing meals because we know that cheaper food options have less processing convenience. And we know that these strategies increase obesity rates. Okay. I'll move on to talking about episodic food availability. One of the things that you really have to understand about food insecurity in the US is that it is a very cyclic and episodic phenomenon. Most households that are food insecure don't have too low access to food every day of the year. They generally have fine access to food for 3 weeks of the month and then not in the last week of the month. Or they're fine during the school year when the kids are eating breakfast and lunch at school, but when the kids are off of school at summertime, they become food insecure. Or they're generally fine while dad is working, but every once in a while dad doesn't have a job for 3 weeks and then they don't have anything to eat. It's very cyclic and episodic. On average, though, a food insecure household goes through 7 episodes of the year of not having enough food to eat. So, although it's cyclic and episodic, it's frequent food scarcity. And the month-to-month variability in intake is seen most acutely among mothers who, again, are trying to buffer their children from the effects of food insecurity. Oh, this 1 minute, come on. So, I will just tell you that about 90% of food stamps or SNAP benefits are spent in the first 2 days after those benefits arrive on the EBT card. This is because people are anxious to use those benefits. I'll give you an example later on of the stress that households are under in the days leading up to the SNAP benefits being reloaded when they've run out of money, when they run out of food stamps and they don't have food in the household. This is an example of how this happened. So this is a natural experiment that was done when there was an unexpected cold snap in the Northeast. There was like a 10 degrees colder than people expected, and people had to buy heating oil. And what you see here is people's fuel costs in the black in the poorer homes and in the white in the richer homes. And you see that fuel costs went way up in both groups, although that went up less in the poor homes because they don't have as much money for it. What's more interesting to me is that if you look at food expenditures, in the richer families, food expenditures also went way up, and in the poorer families, food expenditures went way down. Why did they go way down? If you're spending that much money on heating oil, you can't also feed your kids. We see this in the Bay Area. We see this throughout the United States, but in the Bay Area as well. We see it in demand at food banks and soup kitchens at the end of the month. Big box retailers like Walmart's and Target's will upstaff and increase their inventory at the beginning of the month when food stamps benefits are arriving on people's cards. We can see it in grocery store scanning receipts, and as I said, we can see it among mothers. This is a very old study, but I just like it. This is a quote from another study. The last week of each month, it is an internal panic. This was an experiment that was done to give people additional access to food and looked at women's dietary intake. And what they reported out was, does this additional access to food help or not in terms of how much people eat? And that's fine, not surprisingly, if you give people more food in this low-income population, the moms eat more servings per day in the intervention compared to people who did not get more food. What's more interesting to me is that even with augmented food, the mother's dietary intake goes way down at the end of the month. So this contributes to these abnormal eating behaviors, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples here of quotes that are of mothers talking about their children. I buy a big 5-pound block of cheese twice a month, and when that first comes into the house, it's like everybody's sort of ravenous after stuff. So lots of eating when that food comes in. Towards the first half of the month, the kids, always eat probably more than they should because they get so excited. We know that parents of adolescents reported many more binge eating behaviors among their kids if they're living in food insecure households. Another very common coping strategy is this impulse to hoard food. And I'm going to give you 2 examples again from qualitative interviews with parents. I have this phobia about food, and remembering that experience of having no food, now I constantly have to have food in the house. We start getting low, and I start freaking. Now I like this quote because it brings out something really important in these households, which is that when the mother has had experiences with food insecurity as a child, it changes the way she parents her children. And so we're really worried about the transgenerational passing on of these same eating behaviors. Another quote, our freezer is never empty. It's just cheaper to do it that way. And when I shop, I bargain shop and I buy lots. I will never be hungry again. I mean, I've been through it and it's not fun. Okay, do I have time for this? I think so. During World War II, there was a group of there were a group of people who were conscientious objectors. Sorry, I couldn't think of the term. There's a group of conscientious objectors in the U.S. who were offered the opportunity to not go off to war if they would agree to essentially lose 20% of their body weight and then maintain that weight loss for a period of time while the U.S. government observed their response to lack of access to food. Shocking that we could do this in the U.S., but the number of adolescent boys signed up for this, and this is the summary of their experiences. Subjects became increasingly focused on food. They collected recipes, hung pin-up pictures of food, and changed career plans to food-related activities such as becoming a chef. They also grew increasingly upset and irritable, fighting with each other and their girlfriends. The men appeared apathetic and lethargic and seemed to lose interest in sex, replacing pictures of women with their food pin-ups. In some respects, the most striking change occurred during the semi-starvation period, and after weight was restored to normal and the study had ended. When the men were subsequently allowed to eat as much as they wanted, these previously normal, healthy eaters began to gorge themselves when attractive foods were available. Moreover, they reported feeling out of control of their eating and obsessed with food. Some even stole food or gum. Food restriction actually appeared to produce binge eating in previously normal eaters. Now, there are so many things about this that are totally different than the experience of food insecure households in the U.S. today. These kids lost 20% of their body weight. They were young boys, etc. And yet, when you look at the language that they use to describe their experiences, it is the exact same words that women use to describe their own experiences of being food insecure in the U.S. today. So, we know not only that these disordered eating practices are common in food insecure households, we also know that if you mimic a food insecure household for a mouse or for a rat or for another rodent, what happens? They become obese. Incidentally, they also get diabetes. And they exhibit the same these exact same behaviors. Okay, I will say just a little bit about stress because we don't do a good enough job of understanding stress or setting stress in a food insecure household, but we have to talk about it because it's really important. We know that food insecure households are under an extraordinary amount of stress, and that this stress limits the bandwidth available for parenting your children, registering for benefits like even your SNAP or your CalFresh benefits, applying for or maintaining employment or taking care of your health. And this I think is underappreciated when we talk about ways to intervene in food insecure households. It's clear that food insecure households are under a lot of stress. It's also true that households under a lot of stress are more likely to become food insecure through all the mechanisms of poverty that you can probably think of in your own head. It is both individual and household stress. And I want to mention that if you look at the child behaviors that are common among children who live in very stressed households, they're the same behaviors that we often attribute to food insecurity and to the nutritional aspects of food insecurity. These same behaviors. And so it's very unclear to me the extent to which the nutritional intake is causing most of these behaviors in food insecure kids, or whether it is a reaction to this extraordinary stress at home. We also know that moms are significantly more likely to be depressed and anxious, and they become more depressed and anxious and stressed as their food insecurity gets worse. There's a lot of fear that the child will be taken away from the mom for neglect if they admit that they're not able to feed the child. When I became so scared my son would be taken away. When I see my cupboard becoming empty, I wonder how I'm going to fill it again, and I get panicky. I hear my kids ask me, "Mommy, what's for dinner?" And I sit there at times, and kind of just pace back and forth, thinking to myself, oh my gosh, what is for dinner? Now, I'd just like to remind people here that this is 1 in 7 U.S. households. This is not an uncommon experience in the U.S. There are also extraordinary stories of resilience, and I often have trouble getting through this without crying, because I think this is such an incredible example of how families have learned to deal with the stress of food insecurity. So this is one incredible woman who was talking about food insecurity with her children and how she prepares her children for an episode of food scarcity coming up. We're going through this right now this week, and looking at the kids, we said it's the last week of the month. We make a game out of it. We'll be like, okay, this is like the countdown to the space shuttle going off, okay? Friday's the first of the month, so Friday's the day the space shuttle's gonna go. That's the day we can, yay, because the checks can come in, and we can go buy food. So I said, for this week, this is the countdown to the space shuttle going off. Each day is going to be rough, and it's going to get rougher, and you're going to anticipate more, and you're going to get more excited about that day coming because, we don't have very much food in the house, so we have to eat a lot less. And we'll say, just be strong astronauts, because Friday is the day. This is the U.S. Can I get a glass of water? Okay, I'm going to spend just 5 minutes talking about genetic programming in the fetal environment because I like it, and I think it's really fascinating for us, but I'm going to just stay very big here. There's this sort of idea that people are predisposed to obesity because that's adaptive to cycles of feast and famine. And if you are exposed to famine a lot, then maybe it is adaptive to very efficiently store fat so that you can get through the next famine. And maybe this is a very logical explanation for why women in particular who are exposed to food scarcity, even in the U.S., are more likely to become obese. Or another way of saying it, that natural selection favors women becoming obese if they're food insecure. The problem is this makes so much sense. We almost know this just from being Americans and reading sort of, USA Today and Red Book and whatever magazines you regularly read. The problem is this probably isn't true. There's zero evidence for this being true. what is much more likely to be true is that rather than us being genetically predisposed to put on weight if we're exposed to the stress of food scarcity, what's more likely is that developmental pressures in the womb, when the fetus is not exposed to adequate nutrition, makes that baby much more likely to develop obesity later on. And this has a fancy name which you can ignore. But the important part of this is if baby as a fetus is not getting adequate nutrition, then that baby is programmed to come out into the world sucking up as many calories and as many nutrients as possible so that they will be able to withstand the environment that they're going to be faced with when they come out. Does that make sense? The problem is, what happens if mom is eating plenty of calories but not enough nutrients? What does that fetus see? Well, the hypothesis is that the fetus sees that they're going to be coming out into this environment of famine. And when they get here, what do they get? An extraordinary number of calories, but they are still sucking up those calories and those nutrients as avidly as possible because the expectation is that they're going to be living in a famine environment. And I'll skip this, I'll just leave it at that. So what we know is that among adults, particularly among women, although I will say men are catching up here, food insecurity is associated with a whole range of cardiometabolic risk factors, fancy word for saying obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And the important thing, I think, in the context of this discussion is that these don't happen overnight. That the dietary practices that lead to these diseases are set down in childhood, as you all know. And so intervening on food insecurity in childhood, we can't fix this once a patient is in my office and they're 35 years old. The cat's out of the bag. The roots of this have been laid down in childhood, or maybe, as I just said, even in the womb. All right, so we use a two-item screen to screen for food insecurity among households with children. The questions are, within the past 12 months, we worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. And within the past 12 months, the food we bought just didn't last and we didn't have money to get more. These are the two items that we use. The response options are, was this often true, sometimes true, or never true for you in the last 12 months? And if you say yes, if you say often or sometimes true to either question, we consider you food insecure. There's a much longer study that the USDA uses, that we use in research, that has had decades of experience with it. But for households with children, this is pretty darn good for identifying those households that are going to be food insecure. There is a lovely algorithm put out by the Childhood Hunger Coalition of Oregon that talks about how we respond to this in the clinical setting. It's available online if you're interested in it. And I actually took out the slide where I talk about responses. And since I have a few minutes, I'm just going to talk about that because I think that's important. First of all, I will leave you with this as we talk about responses. This is if you can't see it in the back, it's the dollar menu from McDonald's with the arrow straight ahead that points directly to diabetes. And we see this in San Francisco, and I'm sure all over the Bay Area all the time, where companies really market the dollar menu, and the target audience for those dollar menus and those dollar sodas and those dollar everything is food insecure households, because that's what they're looking for. There's another quote that I didn't put in here about menu labeling, and it was a quote from a guy in Queens who had walked into a McDonald's and they asked him to do an interview about what he thought about the new menu labeling. And he said to the interviewer, well, I'm looking for the most calories I can find because I want to get as many calories as I can for my dollar. And it was a very sort of unexpected way in which menu labeling was working in the food insecure household. So what do you do about it? First of all, I'm a general internist at San Francisco General.
we and the other people who do dietary counseling regularly for this population keep a few very basic things in mind. First of all, we have a very robust hunger safety net, and we have to make sure people are engaging with that hunger safety net. Food pantries, food banks, soup kitchens, congregate meal sites, SNAP or CalFresh, WIC programs, school breakfast and school lunch. There are so many resources out there. Engagement with these resources, maybe with the exception of WIC, which has pretty good engagement, at least in this county, or has excellent engagement in this county, is suboptimal in almost everywhere else. And so we have to find people who aren't enrolled in these programs and get them enrolled. We also need to be thinking about budget neutral ways in order to do our dietary counseling, because as I said, even small dietary substitutions will invariably add costs to people's budgets. I think I'll stop there.